The first Christians were not trying to be good. They had something far more powerful than willpower, and it changed everything about how they lived. This is one of the most overlooked distinctions in all of early Christian history. We often think of religious ethics as a matter of rules. Do this, don't do that, try harder, do better. But the earliest followers of Jesus operated from an entirely different framework, and to understand it, you have to go back, much further back than the first century. You have to go back to Mount Sinai. The Old Covenant was not primarily a set of beliefs. It was an agreement about how a nation would live. God would be Israel's God. Israel would be His people. And this agreement meant something very specific and very practical. It meant that the Israelites must be a nation where the poor would be cared for, the vulnerable would be protected, justice would govern public life, fairness would shape commerce, the land itself would reflect the righteousness of the one who owned it. This was not a contract about what Israel believed in their hearts. It was a contract about how they would order their society. And for centuries, Israel tried to keep it, and struggled, and failed, and tried again. The prophets rose up in every generation to call the people back, not to correct their theology, but to correct their behavior. Feed the hungry, stop oppressing the poor, execute justice at the gate. The law was clear, but human nature was stubborn. What the law revealed generation after generation was that no one could do this by sheer effort. The flesh was simply not strong enough. And then the prophets began to speak of something new. Ezekiel heard it first in the sharpest terms. A day was coming when God would give His people a new heart, a new spirit. He would put His own Spirit within them and cause them to walk in His statutes. Not command them to walk in His statutes, cause them to. Jeremiah heard it too, a new covenant. Not like the one written on stone tablets, this one would be written on the heart itself. These were not abstract promises to the Israelites who heard them. They were promises about power, about enablement, about the radical possibility that one day, somehow, God's people would be able to live rightly, not by having better theology, not by straining against their own weakness, but because something had entered them that was stronger than the human weakness. Then came Pentecost. When Peter stood up in Jerusalem and explained what had just happened, why these people were speaking in languages they had never learned, why the scene looked to some observers like mass intoxication, he did not reach for a philosophical argument. He went straight to the prophet Joel. "This," he said, "is what was spoken by the prophet. In the last days, God will pour out His Spirit on all flesh." The first Christians were almost entirely Jewish, and they understood immediately what this meant, because they had grown up with the stories. They knew what happened when the Spirit of God came upon a person. Think about what they had heard all their lives. Samson was by most accounts not particularly wise or disciplined man, but when the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, he tore apart a lion with his bare hands. He struck down 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. His strength became something beyond human, something extraordinary, and that strength was not his own. It was the Spirit. Saul was a nobody from the smallest tribe, but when the Spirit came upon him, he became a different man. He prophesied, he led armies, he was transformed. Bezaleel, a craftsman, was filled with the Spirit and suddenly had the skill and wisdom to design the entire tabernacle with an artistry beyond anything he had learned on his own. The judges, the prophets, the great kings, the pattern was always the same. An ordinary person comes in contact with the Holy Spirit, and the Spirit makes possible what was previously impossible. Every Jewish child grew up hearing these stories. The Spirit of God was not an abstraction, it was a force that had visibly, historically, dramatically transformed human beings throughout their entire national history. And now, the first Christians were being told, this Spirit has come. Not on one person, not occasionally, but on all flesh. This is why the earliest Christian communities were not focused on willpower. They weren't organizing moral improvement campaigns. They weren't simply teaching people to try harder or feel guiltier when they failed. They believed something genuinely unprecedented had happened. The power that made Samson capable of the impossible, that power was now available to every believer for the work of living righteously. Not moral heroism, moral transformation from the inside out. The Apostle Paul, writing to communities across the Roman world, kept returning to this contrast. He called it the difference between the flesh and the spirit. The flesh strains, the spirit enables. The flesh produces conflict, division, selfishness. The Spirit produces love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. This was not poetry, it was a practical description of what they believed was actually happening in their communities. But there was a second thing, and this one is even more striking. Before the New Covenant, the way Israel dealt with sin was exhausting. There were sin offerings, guilt offerings, purification rites. There were sacrifices for unintentional sins, for known sins, for the sins of the community, for the sins of the priests. On the Day of Atonement, the entire nation gathered to face the weight of everything they had done wrong in the past year. Imagine living inside that system. Every sacrifice is a reminder. Every time you bring your offering to the priest, you are counting your failures. You are standing before God as a debtor, calculating the ledger. The debt never truly disappears. It only rolls over to the next year, and the next, and the next. The weight of that was real. The guilt was constant. And then the forgiveness. Not the temporary covering of a sacrifice, but the complete removal of the debt. Jesus himself had told a story about this. A servant who owed an unimaginable sum, 10,000 talents, was brought before the king. There was no way to repay it, and the king simply canceled the debt entirely. Not reduced, gone completely. Jesus said that a person who has been forgiven that much cannot help but overflow with forgiveness towards others. The first Christians had experienced exactly this. People who had spent their lives inside a system of constant moral accounting were suddenly told the account was closed, not postponed, closed. God had demonstrated love for them in a way so costly, so total, so unreserved, that the response it produced was not relief alone, it was a kind of overflowing. You cannot receive that and remain unmoved, and unmoved people do not reorder their lives. So here you have two forces working together in the first Christian communities. The Spirit of God, the same Spirit that had visibly empowered the greatest figures in Israel's history, now available to ordinary people, enabling them to live beyond their natural capacity. And the love of God, demonstrated in a way so complete that it produced gratitude that overflowed into love, mercy, generosity, and forgiveness towards others. These were not abstract doctrines to be affirmed in a creed. They were the actual mechanism by which early Christians believed righteous living became possible. And this is why when you read the earliest Christian writings, Paul's letters, the Didache, the accounts and Acts, you find a community deeply, practically concerned with how people actually behave toward one another, with honesty, with generosity, with the care of widows and orphans, with how disputes were handled, with the treatment of the poor. They had not walked away from the Old Covenant emphasis on righteous living. That concern was baked into the bones of every Jewish believer among them. What had changed was the source of power. They were not relying on willpower. They were not relying on the law. They were relying on two things: the Spirit and the compelling power of the love of God, and they believed those two things made possible what hundreds of years under Moses had shown could not be achieved by human effort alone. The contrast with the Pharisees in the minds of the first Christians was stark. The Pharisees were serious, disciplined, and genuinely committed to righteous living. No one should dismiss them for trying. But the Pharisees were working by the flesh, meticulous rule-keeping, detailed interpretations of the law, fence upon fence upon fence around every commandment. The early Christians believed they had something the Pharisees did not superior intelligence, not a better moral philosophy. They believed they had been given an internal power that the old system had never been able to provide. This raises questions worth sitting with. Modern Christianity has sometimes moved in a direction that the first Christians would find puzzling. The emphasis has often shifted to doctrine as intellectual assent, what you believe rather than how you live. Righteousness is sometimes spoken of as positional, a legal status, rather than a lived reality. The earliest Christians do not seem to have made this separation. For them, the Spirit and the love of God were not signs of a new theological system. They were the enabling force behind a new kind of community, one that could actually embody justice, mercy, generosity, and love in its neighborhood. Whether that vision was sustained is a different question. Whether it is recoverable is a question for another video. But what the earliest records suggest is this: the first Christians did not downplay righteous living in favor of abstract knowledge. They rather elevated righteous living. They believed for the first time in the history of Israel's long struggle with the law that they had been given the power to actually live it. If this kind of exploration is worth your time, if understanding what the first Christians actually believed and how they actually lived matters to you, subscribe. There is much more to uncover. And share your thoughts below. What surprised you most here? And do you think modern Christianity has retained this early emphasis on Spirit-empowered righteous living, or has something been lost along the way?